Welcome back. We're going to be looking at doing our texture drawings today, and I'm just using a regular graphite pencil, nothing special, just your everyday pencil. When I start transferring these implied textures down, because we took photos of real textures last time, I'm going to start just like I do any of our drawings, and I'm going to start with making some of those basic outlines of the shapes that are in there. So for example, I'm going to look at the rocks and I can even feel if I want to practice where I don't really draw on it, but I make my hand do the motions as if I was drawing it, because then that helps me to go through and draw down here. And you notice I don't draw like one continuous line. I do these light feathery lines so that I can go back and erase things if I need to, if I make a mistake while I'm drawing. I know some of these stones overlap one another, so I'm just going to do it with them showing for now. So you'll see that overlap here instead of trying to skip spaces. It just makes it a little easier for the initial drawing part that I'm doing. And I'm taking my time as I go around and do these, trying to compare where they space themselves on the paper as well. They're all a little different, and this doesn't have to be picture perfect. We're just trying to get the general idea of where each of these stones goes and leave the little shadowy areas where they need to be. I have one that's crammed in here. It gets kind of shadowy, and there's another tiny one in here. And what really makes these show up are the little shadows that we're going to go back and put in here in just a minute. There's one there, there's a little loop of one here, sort of like that. All right. Now I have the general outlines in. I'm going to go back and I'm going to start adding my value. And we've been working with that value where we color something really dark, where it should be dark. So I'm pushing firmly with my pencil. And that's going to be the deepest, darkest shadows in here, just around the edges of the rock. But then those shadows are going to get a lot lighter when I get to the rock. So I'm going to push more gently. I start dark back here, and as I move forward, I get lighter, so that it's barely touching the paper, and then it really gives you the sense that there are some deep crevices in there, but then there's still a rock that's also in there. If you want to smooth it out, you can always go in with your fingers a little bit like this. If it goes over the line, just go back in with your eraser, and you can cut those edges so that it stays nice and white, like that. You're going to continue this process all the way around, shading in all the areas that need shading from dark to light. Let's speed that up for you so you don't have to be here watching me do this all day. Now I'm using a technique called Scrumbling, and you're going to lay your pencil on the side so you're getting this wide flat part on here, and I go very gently in tiny little circles. I can even feel the wood scratch a little bit on the paper while I do this, because I want a nice light gradation in here. I don't want it really dark, but I find if I do it on the point, I end up getting these little zigzaggy lines, which I don't really want in these rocks. They don't have zigzaggy lines, right? They have much more of a rounded look to them. So if I do it this direction and I do little tiny circles, that's going to give me much more of that rock texture feel that I'm looking for in this one, as opposed to if we were doing the feathers or fur, like over here, then it's gonna wanna be more of that zigzaggy type line. So turning your pencil on the side and gently adding in some layers, that way it gives you a much better look. Now you can remember anytime you go over, if you go through and smooth it out, you can also go back in with your eraser and erase to those hard lines so that it's not going where it shouldn't for those shadows. So you can see where I've gone in and I've added all of the shading in here. I also went through and you can blend that a little bit with your finger. I was still careful to leave those white highlights on some of my rocks where there's no graphite at all to really make it look like they are more rounded. So the next one we're going to look at is this wood grain over here, and when we do the wood grain, similarly, we're going to try and figure out sort of roughly where it is. Now the nice thing about wood grain is it does have a natural little zigzag to it, so you can kind of cheat when you do it and do this tiny little feathery edge. You'll notice it gets a little thicker in some areas than others when it's pointing, and that's because the shadow's coming down sort of from the top side, or sorry, the light's coming down from the top side, creating a shadow on the bottom side. And you can go through and do just some tiny little zigzags. You want to keep your pencil sharp and pointed when you're working with this one. The lines get a little thicker and a little thinner depending on where they're moving. And wood grain doesn't have to be an exact replica. You just want to get the general shape and pattern going for this one so that it pops a lot more. You'll notice by the time we get up here even, it's more of a matter of repeating those lines. Again, they don't have to be perfectly straight because it's wood grain, but you do want to have some closer together and some further apart from each other as you're working up here to create more of that, layered look to it. Because the tree grows, as it grows, those bark layers change each year and they start making the rings inside those trees. And these are some of the veins where the water can move up and down the tree and the nutrients and things like that. So you get different amounts and different widths as they come and go. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to keep making some of these larger and thicker and other ones smaller and thinner. For this next part, I go through and I take my eraser and I erase back out some of those lines to add back in some of the highlights. Now there are some naturally darker areas in the wood, so I'm going to go in and add a little bit more shading. Mine's not as dark as the one up above, but I don't have a fine eraser to go back in and color the whole thing first and then erase back out. So I'm going to make mine a little bit lighter, but still continue to have the texture. Now we're going to look at the cat fur. If you look at the one up here, I'm not going to draw every single hair. That would take us all day long. Instead, what I'm going to do is take the value that's up here. So we have all these midtones and then some darker areas. So I'm going to draw in those darker areas first, and then I'm going to go back in and add some of the midtones. And I'm going to smudge it. I want to keep going the same direction that the fur is going, which is much easier for me to draw side to side instead of up and down. So I've turned my paper. I'm going to go in and roughly sketch in those dark areas first, and then I'm going to go back in and add the midtones, smudge with my finger to get it all over, and then go back in and add some highlights with my eraser. And I don't worry about being really neat and even with this. If I go outside the edges down here, I can always go back with my eraser, just erase those out. For this part, I'm going to blend it a little bit with my fingers to sort of smooth it out and get that overall color. And then I'm going to go back in and start adding a couple of individual hairs. Remember, they almost always pull in and out. So think of it at a smaller microscopic level. Your pencil lead should be going from super thin to a little thicker to really thin again. So the way that you would make a pencil mark like this do that is you start really gentle, you push harder, and then you push gently again so it comes back up off the paper. And that's what I'm doing when I'm going back in and adding just a few of these little hairs. And I do that. You don't have to add them everywhere, but if you do them a few places, it gives the impression that there's fur everywhere here. And so it kind of tricks your brain. Remember, we've talked about that, where your brain fills things in automatically into feeling like there's a lot more fur there than you've actually drawn. And just like the other ones, I'm going to start by trying to find those general outlines. This. And I put the deeper, darker lines in there. Then again, go back through with your finger and you can kind of blur those out. They're going to be in the background anyway, so we don't need them to be super sharp. Go back and keep my pumpkin stem in there though. I don't want that to get lost. So once I get those general outlines in, I'm going to go back in and start adding the value, using a little bit of that scumbling and a little bit of line work back and forth, using my finger for a little bit of the blending as well, and an eraser to go back and add my highlights in. For the next section, I'm going to start by adding a little bit of gray in the same direction as the broomsticks to make sure that we're starting to get that gray tone, because there aren't any super bright whites on this one. After I do that, I can go back in and I can add some of the darker areas on the side of my pencil and then the finer areas at the tip of the pencil. You can also use the edge of your eraser to go back in and add a few white highlights here and there. But really, this is just working back and forth between adding in some light, some dark, and some medium tone areas. And then any place where it looks like there's a little bit of triangle in there for the shading, I'm going back and adding that in a little bit darker. For this last one up here, we have the braided hair. It's a little bit more difficult because the hairs overlap one another and they sort of weave in and out and tangle a little bit, which is natural. But it means it makes a really fuzzy look in here. So you have to pay close attention to the different angles that the hair is in the braid. And then we can't use all straight lines in here because it has a little bit of that fuzzy look to it. So I'm gonna get the general outlines of everything put in. And then I'm gonna go back with that scumbling motion and add in the shading along with a few fine lines. And I try and draw those basic shapes, staying in the same direction as the hair to reinforce it. And here's where I'm going to go in and use that scumbling technique on the side of my pencil. So a little bit of circles and a little bit of stripes with that to add in the shading.